Well, let's turn to Mark chapter 12, and it's a parable that we don't focus on a lot. It's not a parable that we've spent a lot of time thinking about, probably. And yet it's interesting that it's in all three synoptic gospels. This was a really core part. This was something that as Matthew looked at his audience, and Mark looked at his audience, and Luke looked at his audience, they all thought this is a story that has to be told. This is, if we're going to understand who Jesus is and what it means to follow him, we're going to have to understand this story. So it's about a man who has built a vineyard, bought the land, developed the land, and has done everything the land needs, and then imparts the care of that land to some tenant farmers. And so let's just read it, and let's think about this. This is a story about Israel not being good stewards of the kingdom of Israel that God had given them. And so it might be one of the reasons we don't think about it much, because we are not Israel. We are spiritual Israel. We are not physical Israel. And the story that Jesus is telling here doesn't directly apply to us. And yet at the end of it, why don't we spend some time thinking, well, what has God sent to us, and how can we make the same mistake of not stewarding well what God has given us? Okay, so, and he began to speak to them in parables. I did want to tell you too, before we read this, at the end of this, they want to arrest him and murder him. Like, this was not like, oh, there's four soils, go and think about it. This was a direct accusation on the Jewish leadership by the Jewish rabbi who is their Messiah. That is so scathing that they want him dead at the end of this. Okay. And he began to speak to them in parables. A man planted a vineyard and put a fence around it and dug a pit for the winepress and built a tower and leased it to tenants and went into another country. I think the big idea at the start of this is that God, as he planted Israel, the vineyard Israel. The vineyard is, I think, the most common metaphor for Israel that the Old Testament uses and that Jesus draws on in his parables. So he did everything necessary for this thing to thrive. This was not, hey, Abraham, I'm going to ask you to do stuff on your own. No, rather this was, Abraham, I've chosen you. Moses, I've chosen you. You know, the prophets come, like all this is God's doing. God has done everything to protect and to provide for his people. Their job is to steward God's provision. God has not asked us to build the church. He had not asked them to build Israel. Rather, he said, this is something I am doing, and what I'm asking you to do is steward it. Okay. Verse 2, when the season came, he sent a servant to the tenants to get from them some of the fruit of the vineyard. And they took him and beat him and sent him away empty-handed. And again he sent to them another servant, and they struck him on the head and treated him shamefully. And they sent another, and they killed him, and so with many others. Some they beat, and some they killed. Now, the people of the Jewish leaders of the time revered the prophets. And yet, Jesus is saying, I want you to think about how we as a people treated the prophets. God sent prophets saying, would you please turn back to me? As the people in the Old Testament wandered away from God to idolatry, to really it boils down to two things over and over. They don't take care of the poor and they worship idols. And there's all kinds of immorality involved with both those things. And Jesus says, look, God the Father, like Yahweh, sent prophet after prophet. And what the people did, what Israel did, there's very few instances of, oh, prophet, you know what, you're right, we're going to turn back to God. Rather, the prophets were beaten, ignored, and killed. So Jesus is telling these, men, hey, remember that these men you revere now, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Elijah and Elisha, these men that you revere and say, oh yes, the great prophets of old. Well, our forefathers did not listen to them, but rather ignored them, beat them, and murdered them. And at this point, I think the people standing around probably are looking at Jesus going, yeah, okay, where are you going with this? So let's see where he's going with this. Verse 6, he had still one other, a beloved son. Finally, he sent him to them, saying, "They will respect my son." But those tenants said to one another, "This is the heir. Come, let us kill him, and the inheritance will be ours." And they took him and killed him and threw him out of the vineyard. What will then the owner of the vineyard do? He will come and destroy the tenants and give the vineyard to others. Have you not read the scripture? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This was the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. Jesus is, it just couldn't be clearer. Jesus is saying, you ignored the prophets. You ignored John even. And here I am, God's own beloved son, in front of you. And instead of repenting and returning to God, just like your forefathers, you're going to say, no, we want to be in charge of the kingdom. And I think that's the big idea. And here's one of the application points for me and you. We can either let God be in charge of the kingdom, the whole world, our lives, or we can say, no, I want to be in charge. God is going to work for me instead of me serving him. So the people hear this and they are just cut to the core. They couldn't be angrier about what Jesus is saying, because he is accusing them not only of being like those that rejected the prophets, but far worse than that, saying, no, you want to inherit the kingdom by violence, by rejecting God's son himself. So then verse 12, it has their reaction. And they were seeking to arrest him, but feared the people, for they perceived that he had told a parable against them. So they left him and went away. So the religious leaders, the hierarchy in Jerusalem, they say, man, we got to get him for this. And this is like one of the places where we see the pressure against Jesus building. And they want to arrest him, but they understand that the people know what's going on. The people understood the parable perfectly. And so now's not the time for them to jump. Now's not the time for them to act. How do we apply this to our lives today? How can we live differently today because of this? Well, I think in the simplest terms, we could say, look, let's understand that we also have the ability to reject the thing that we are, called to steward. Jesus said, I will build my church and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. Jesus is building his church. Jesus is involved in a worldwide mission. And we can either resist that and live for ourselves, or we can not only submit to that, but get on mission, work with Christ, and watch him use us to his glory. And here's the problem with the chief priests and the hierarchy in Jerusalem. They wanted it to equal their glory. And look, there can only be one God. There can only be one king. And you have to choose. Is that you or is it Jesus? So today, don't work for your glory. Work for his. Don't be so arrogant to think you're building something in the world, but rather get on board with what Jesus is building. Love him. Abandon yourself and walk with him faithfully. All right. Be loved, Lighthouse.